There are a lot of people in the United States here on visas. What that means is that they have temporary permission to be in the country because they're a student or they're under a certain employment arrangement or they've come from a country that allows them to come in for a temporary period of time. All of these visas contain an exit date. Anyone who comes in on a visa has a date by which they need to leave the country. And if they decide to overstay, they will fall out of legal status and they will then become an undocumented person. An undocumented person in the United States is at risk of being picked up or apprehended or deported at any moment. Most of these apprehensions occur after a criminal arrest. In fact, over 95% of them do. So it's not as if someone overstays a visa and then immigration shows up at their house. There's not the resources to do that. There are certain individuals maybe who are being watched by immigration and they will be picked up if they overstay their visa or violate their student visa, for example. But for the most part, the consequences of overstaying a visa are that this person becomes undocumented and then they live with all the risks of anyone who's living in this country as an undocumented person. The biggest of which is you can be deported at any time, but also you don't have work permission, so job options are very limited. And it's generally not a good idea. It's generally a much better idea to consult with an immigration lawyer when you have a valid visa to talk through whether you have options of extending that visa. Okay, let's say somebody came in on a visa and they were given a certain period of time to be in the country and then they overstayed for whatever reason. Could have been an illness, could have been just a decision. Now they're undocumented, and what can they do? Well, the ways that people typically immigrate permanently in this country are through employment, family, or humanitarian cases. I'll start with employment. It's the most restrictive. And in general, employment cases say anybody that has unlawful presence or time without permission in the country can't immigrate through employment. So that's generally off the table. Family cases are more nuanced. If someone has overstayed, but they're the immediate relative of a U.S. citizen, they can still get a green card. But if they're not the immediate relative of a U.S. citizen, things look a little bit different for them. Finally, the humanitarian cases, which is for victims of trafficking, victims of crime, victims of domestic violence. This type of case has generally more waivers and options available to people who have violated their visas. So generally in a humanitarian case, a visa overstay is not an issue. About half the time in a family immigration case, an overstay is an issue, and almost all the time in an employment case, a visa overstay is an issue. But this is a broad generalization of a very complex topic. So as I always say, it's really important for each person to consult about their own case with an immigration lawyer they trust as early as possible. In the realm of immigration, we have something called unlawful presence bars. What does that even mean? This is a rule about people overstaying or being in the country without permission and leaving and coming back. So the rules are, if somebody is in the country for more than 6 months without permission and they leave, they can't come back for 3 years. If they're here for more than a year as a visa overstay or as an undocumented person and they leave, they can't come back for 10 years. Now, those 3 and 10-year bars have waivers available to them, so somebody under one of those bars can still resolve the issue. But there's a more serious bar that we call the permanent bar. That's when someone has more than a year of unlawful presence in the country or a deportation, and then they leave the country and then they come back without status. So let's say someone was here, they overstayed their visa 10 years ago and they left, their visa expired and they came back without status. That person is subject to this permanent bar. And that bar says you have to leave the country for 10 years before you can even apply for a waiver to come back. It's pretty serious. And generally, the only way to overcome these is if you have a humanitarian case, like crime victim, trafficking victim, domestic violence victim. But family immigration, employment immigration generally is off the table for someone subject to the permanent bar. Absent some move from Congress, which I hope occurs, because the reality is that there are millions of families living in this country who are impacted by the permanent bar. And I've heard lots of stories of people who they had to leave the country to go to a funeral or to take care of a sick relative, but their family was here, their kids were here, they came back, and now all of a sudden they have this permanent bar. So it's really something that we should fix in our immigration system when we finally do have immigration reform. Somebody once asked me which is worse, between a visa overstay or somebody that enters without permission. And it's a really interesting question, and it's the reality or the data around this has shifted over the years. Because about 15 to 20 years ago, most people would just come in at the US-Mexico border because the border was pretty porous. It was actually easy for people to get in without permission. But the border has been pretty much on lockdown for the last 20 years or so. And so the number of people who are in this country who are undocumented but who entered with a visa has risen, so that now more than half of the undocumented population in this nation are visa overstays. So ultimately, what's worse? I mean, if you're looking at it from the perspective of the person, it's going to be better for them to have entered legally because that opens more options for them in future immigration. In my opinion, this data and information is just an indication of the need for immigration reform, because the reality is we have a nation that needs immigrants. We have jobs for them. There aren't ways for people to come and go and work like they used to. So people are violating visas in order to be able to stay, which to me is just an indication that we need a reform of our employment immigration system so that if U.S. companies need workers and immigrants are available to fill the jobs, that there are ways to do that legally so that people don't have to overstay their visa to fill the jobs that we have in this nation.